And all right, great. Let me hit got it here. Well, I welcome y'all to our Wednesday night tech session. We try to do this once a month. I'm Gary Edwards. I'm president of Peachtree section. And Diana Quinn, our Eastern Regional Director, is assisting and hosting this event for us. So we really appreciate her helping out with that. Just for y'all that don't know me, I'm not a professional mechanic. I'm just a retired nuclear trained naval officer and a former submarine captain. But I have been working on cars on the side for basically over 50 years now. And I work on my cars basically because I have to. I really couldn't afford to own all the nice cars I do if I paid somebody to work on them for me. But I also enjoy solving hard problems. And I do these tech sessions and I write tech articles because I want to encourage people to work on their own cars. I believe that a lot of these cars you really almost can't own if you are paying somebody else to work on them, because they can be so expensive and they're getting kind of old, and the amount of people that know how to work on them are kind of drying up. So I really encourage people to work on their own cars. When I do these tech sessions, I don't do a step-by-step how to do the job. I mean, that's certainly available. It's available in the workshop manual. It's available at, well, for example, Pelican Parts, a number of other places. But I try to go over kind of the general flow of the procedure, but also what I learned from doing the procedure. As I was mentioning before we started, I approached this as it was going to be a pretty trivial, easy thing. And it's not as easy as I thought it was going to be. It's probably, I don't know, you may disagree, but I thought it was kind of a little moderate difficulty. So I just wanted to go over it. Those in Peachtree probably saw my article on this in our most recent newsletter as well. So let me screen share here, and I'll show you the car that I'm talking about. And so the car that I was doing this work on is a 92 300 CE24 that I actually paid $2,250 for, which was pretty astounding. But the damper it has it's called a version 1 with external damper. And this is the picture from the factory workshop manual. This is what it looks like. It's hard against this background to see my pointer, but this is the tensioner in here, and that vertical thing is the damper. It's a shock absorber. And you have this adjusting lever that goes on the back of it that's pretty much invisible when you're in the car, and a bracket on the front of it that supports it, and this pointer. So, and we'll go into more detail about that. And I've got several cars that had this tensioner and ones like it, and it's the first one I've ever replaced. So I kind of infer that they're pretty reliable. Now, how do you know you have one of these? I know we were talking about Byron. He's got a 190E. That 4-cylinder engine has one that's very similar to this. And in fact, if you look at the procedure on the Peach Parts website, if you look up a 124, what they tell you is for a later version of the tensioner. It's not the one that has this adjusting rod and nut. If you want to look it up on the Peach Parts site, go to the 190E, because that's the car that they wrote it for. It's essentially this tensioner. So this is a picture looking down on the tensioner with the arrow pointed to the right place. And this is pretty much all you can see of this tensioner, which is why I was a little confused, honestly, on how it worked. And we'll get to that. Once I finally had it out in my hand, it was pretty apparent how it worked. I've got a diagram to show you that. But so you see this adjusting nut sitting up here. And you see the body of the tensioner here, the little pointer. And there's a nut out here that's kind of invisible in the picture that fastens the fixed portion of the tensioner to the car. And that's about all you can see. And so it's not the most obvious on how it works. Now, a couple of others that are similar. This is a early M119. You notice the adjusting nut is very similar. This does not have the external damper. The tensioner is down here. But the neat thing about the 119, the front of the engine isn't as crowded, and so that you can see the tensioner better. And you can see the lever that adjusts the fixed portion of the tensioner right here. Here's the adjusting nuts up here, and there's the threaded rod going down here to this lever. And so you can see here how it adjusts the tensioner. You can't see this on an M104 and M102 because the front of the engine is so crowded. And this is another picture from the same M119 engine. There's supposed to be a pointer in here, and this car did not have a pointer. And so I'll mention how I tensioned this belt without a pointer a little bit later. And then this is another M119 in my collection. And you note that it's got the bracket for the adjusting nut, but no adjusting nut. And I believe for this car, someone went and fitted it to the later tensioner, which does not have an adjusting nut at all. The later versions of the tensioner on the M119 and the M113 engine are more like a Ford truck, where all you do is put a socket on this nut, and then you rotate in the counterclockwise direction. You take the tension off the belt, you pull the belt off the tensioner, and then you let the tensioner go back. And on the M113 engine, there's actually a little place on the tensioner where you can lock it in the detensioned position. It's really quite convenient, but these tensioners are a little bit more complex that we're going to talk about today. All right, so let me talk a little bit about my kind of maintenance philosophy. Now, I call it kind of doing the nuclear approach from my nuclear background. And, the nuclear approach has several aspects. One is you always have to have a procedure to work from. And in this case, it's the Workshop Manual Procedure 13-3200. This is the first page of it, removing and installing the tensioning device. And, honestly, I believe that for this type of tensioner, you ought to look it up every time you touch one of these tensioners, because they can be subtly different. And there's some very important things about adjusting these tensioners, or you can break things, and you don't want to do that. The second aspect of the nuclear approach is maintain cleanliness standards. So it makes the most sense to clean before you disassemble it, and then you clean again before you do reassembly. And for this job in particular, you're opening up a hole in the timing cover. And let me go to the next picture. You see this big black arrow in this diagram. This is where the factory workshop manual calls out that this bolt goes through the timing cover, and you have to put sealant on it to seal it when you put it back in. But it also means the whole time that you have that bolt out, you got a hole in the timing cover, and you don't want anything to fall in there. And so you've got to make sure you're clean when you pull it out. You've got to make sure that it's covered when you're doing the subsequent cleaning. And that means you have to put protection over it. So the next point is you use what's called FME protection, or foreign material exclusion protection, in holes, in openings, and any hoses that you take off. And then you absolutely have to remember to pull them out before you put them back together. The other part is bagging and tagging parts. This is a picture of the little Ziploc bags that I use. These are snack size bags. I think they work really well for small parts. And I always have a paint marker with me. I write where they go, and I put them down. I actually stack them in the order that they come off the car, so that when you're doing the reassembly, you can just pick them up in order, and it tells you what they are. And if there's anything unusual about them, like if the bolts are different sizes or something, or they have different washers on them, I often draw a picture on them to help in reassembly. The other piece is special tools, making sure you have the special tools that you need. And this is a very handy tool set. This is a water pump and fan hub removal tool set. And you use a couple of tools in here during this job. I'll call them out a little bit later. You also need some torque wrenches of the appropriate scale. And I'll talk more about torque wrenches. And take the time to do it right. Don't rush. I do not like to work with any type of time constraint. I mean, if you don't have the time to do it right the first time, where are you going to get time to redo it? And I do not like to work with, I have to get the car to some customer by a certain time. I do my own cars. I do them slowly. If I have a doubt on the way I did it, I redo it. And so, you do not want to have a time constraint if you can avoid it. And I put this picture up. I say, take lots of pictures. Take lots of pictures. You never really know, what you need to go back and look at. So if you just take a lot of pictures during the process, when you get to a point where you say, how did that go? Where did that wire run go? Then you have a picture to go back and reference how it goes. So take lots of pictures. Okay, I'm going to come out of screen sharing for a minute. Now, let me tell you why I had to change this belt tensioner. For this car, I started having a little bit of belt squeal on startup. And this car has 209,000 miles on it. And I was planning to take it to Fort Lauderdale, which is a 9-hour drive. Since it was having that belt squeal, I did a tightening adjustment on the belt, but it didn't have a pointer. So it's a little hard to tell what you're doing if you don't have the pointer. So I tightened it and the squealing stopped, drove it to Fort Lauderdale, went on a 2-week cruise, came back after the car's been sitting 2 weeks, started it up, and it had this tremendous amount of belt squeal, more than I've ever heard. And I thought, oh no, we're not going to get home. And then it went away. So, okay, loaded the car, started home. And it was really pretty good, other than every time that I stopped for gas and restarted the car, I got a little bit of belt squeal. And then I got about 5 miles from home. And every time I went to idle, turning a corner or something and took my foot off the gas, I got a pretty big belt squeal. But I got home safely. So the next day I looked at the timing belt and it had like 0 tension, like no tension at all on it. I was just amazed that the car kept going. But it's kind of a testimony to how good these cars are and how reliable the belt drive is, that with almost no tension, and even with the air conditioning running, I was able to get home. And so that's what kind of forced me to have to change the tensioner, because I just didn't have any tension on the belt. So why was I confused about how these work? Let me go back to screen sharing. And let's see. Why was I confused about how these work? Well, again, back to that picture I showed you. Look at this. You can't see hardly anything on about the tensioner other than the body and the adjuster. But so let me explain what I learned once I had these things in my hand. Now, what I don't have, I did not picture the shock absorber, which comes off on this side. But for this tensioner, it sits on the car about as pictured here. And let's say you want to tighten it. Well, there's that nut on the top, and you turn it clockwise to tighten. But one of the big important learning points about this tensioner is you never try to adjust this tensioner before you release the locking bolt, which is the bolt that holds it to the car. It goes through the center of this tensioner. Some of them have them off to the side, but in this case, it's to the center of the tensioner. You've got to loosen this bolt before you try to turn the adjusting nut, or you will either bend the bracket or you will strip the adjusting rod. And honestly, an awful lot of these have stripped adjusting rods because people have tried to do this. Okay, so major learning point, never try to adjust this type of tensioner without loosening the locking bolt. Okay, so assuming we've loosened the locking bolt, then we turn the nut clockwise to tighten. Now, this threaded rod is reverse threaded. So, you'd think tightening would pull the rod up, but since it's reverse threaded, tightening it pushes the rod down. And what you can't see in this picture is this little lever that goes over to the fixed part of the tensioner, and it pushes down on the lever, which rotates the whole assembly to the right, and thus tensioning the belt. Now, what it actually does, though, you're actually adjusting the position of the fixed portion of the tensioner. That's why you had to loosen up the mounting bolt in the middle. You're changing the position of the fixed portion of the tensioner, and it's bonded with this elastomeric rubber compound to the outer portion of the tensioner. And so as you move the fixed portion counterclockwise, you can see that it would put force on the outer portion to turn it counterclockwise and tension the belt. Now, the pointer is attached to the fixed portion, and so as you tension the belt, the pointer goes farther and farther to the left, you started out with it on this little ridge here at the small end of the ramp. And when you're fully tensioned, the pointer is pointing over to the large end of the ramp over here. And that puts a significant amount of force on the elastomeric, essentially spring, which forces the belt tight. It's really as simple as that, but you can't see that with it on the car. Okay. Now, if the pointer is broken off, well, there's a lot of work to replace it because it sits behind the bracket. But if the pointer is broken off, you know, you can see the pointer is right here. I bet that's a little hard to see, but notice this, the whole mounting bracket is in front of the pointer. And so the whole thing has to come off to be able to change that pointer. You do want that pointer to be there because it's a little bit hard to figure out the proper tension. Now, let me mention what happened on the one that had the pointer broken off. This was a 500E. I actually flew out to Dallas to drive it home. Didn't look at the Serpentine Belt, fortunately. Got home, looked at the Serpentine Belt. I would have been panicked if I had looked at it before I drove it, but the belt looked awful. So I had to change it. And it has a, you know, it was in one of the pictures I previously showed you. It was the one that did not have a pointer. And so I took a belt tensioning tool, which happens to be the tool you use on the timing belt on a Porsche 944, and measured the belt tension. And then I backed off the tension using the adjuster and changed the belt. And then I adjusted the belt to that tension. And there's a lot of generic, you know, belt tension type tools like that that you can use. It's just that, as we were talking before we started, there's no workshop manual reference on how tight that's really supposed to be. It just references that pointer. But in a pinch, that's the way I did it in that case. And let's see. Yeah, I was kind of surprised by the scope of this job. I mean, it's not hugely difficult, but it's not trivial. And if I go to the first page of the workshop manual, it shows you having to take these two pulleys off. But you also have to take off the fan shroud, the fan, and the hub for the fan. So it's 3 pulleys you have to take off to do this job. And since you have to take the serpentine belt off, by the way, always have a diagram. Notice I drew the diagram for this one. You can also find the diagram in the workshop manual. Always have a diagram when you take one of these serpentine belts off. It is easy, fairly easy, to put one on incorrectly. Now, what happens when you put one on incorrectly? Well, it shreds itself in a few miles. I've done this. I'm embarrassed to say I've actually done this. Your other indication, if you're putting it on in the wrong routing, is it might be really, really, really tight, and you might have to really struggle to get it on. But so that's why I say always have a belt routing diagram, because you can screw it up. Now, again, you have to loosen the center bolt. And there's a picture of the center bolt before you try to adjust this. I mean, that is a major point on these. And if you suspect the threaded rod might have been stripped previously, then this is a good time when you're changing the tensioner to also replace the threaded rod. It's back in here, and you have to get the entire tensioner off to replace the shredded rod. So if there's any doubt about it, get a new threaded rod as well. Now you have to remove 3 pulleys to get to this. And there's 3 different tools that you end up using. To unbolt the fan, you've got to block the fan hub. And this is the perfect tool. It's made for blocking the fan hub. There's a little hole in the back of the fan pulley, and there's a ridge on the front of the timing case that you put this end of the tool against and block the pulley from turning so that you can unbolt the fan from it and then unbolt the pulley from the front of it. So that works for the fan hub. This tool works really well for the power steering pump. You put it over the bolts and it holds them. However, you really can't use it on let me go back and show you. You can't use it on the water pump pulley. Now, the water pump pulley and the power steering pulley are the same pulley. They're just inverted from each other. But the fact that this one is inverted means you can't get that neat holding tool on it. I think I may have used a strap wrench on it to hold that one, or I may have just put the socket on it when the wrench and spun the pulley and broke the nuts loose that way. I mean, there's not much torque on these nuts. They're 10mm headed, they're M8 nuts, and they're pretty easy to get off. I also marked the position of the pulleys against the hub. I'm not sure it really makes a difference, but I wanted to put them on in the same position, so I marked them. And it's very useful to make sure you know which one's the power steering and which one is the water pump if you're going to do that, since either one will go on and they're the same one. Now, I heard that the fan has to stay vertical, and so I stored it in the vertical position, but I'm not sure how true it is. The workshop manual does not say you have to do that. Okay, so after you've got those removed, you see something that looks like this. And then you have to pull off this bracket, and there's 3 bolts in this bracket, and each of the bolts is different. The upper bolt here, the top bolt bolts into the aluminum case. Now, anytime you're bolting into aluminum, you've got to be very careful and alert for stripping the aluminum threads. And in this case, this one came out and it wasn't as tight as I would have expected it to be. So that's kind of an indication that maybe your threads are bad. And in this case, the threads were really kind of screwed up, and I took a tap and ran it through and cleaned the threads up, and I was able to clean them up enough that it could hold torque. And the question, of course, is how do you know your threads are okay? Well, can you get to the required torque or not? If you can get to the required torque, your threads are fine. If you can't get to the required torque, that means your threads are bad. You have to use a repair, either a helicoil or a time cert, which I did not have to do in this job, but I talked about it in the last tech session I did, which is on our YouTube channel. Okay, so that's the top bolt. The bottom bolt is a through bolt, and so it's got a nut on the back of it. And if you don't know the nuts there, you try to loosen that bolt, and then it just will turn forever. And it's not so obvious that there's a nut on the back of it because it's really hidden. It's very hard to see, and you can pretty much put your hand on it. If you shine the light right in the right place, you can pretty much see it. But the other thing that complicated it for me was that, I was assuming I've got a 13mm socket on the front of it. Well, gee, it ought to be a 13mm socket on the back. And so I was trying a 13mm wrench on it, and you can't see it well enough to see that the wrench isn't fitting very well. But after a while, I tried a 14, and oh, that fits. And so it was a little subtle, but it actually had a 14 on the back and a 13 on the front. And it's way back on the other side of the power steering pump, so it's really hard to see and hard to get to. Now, in the other one, the one that's over here, just a little bit out of the picture. Let me find the picture of that one. Okay, over here, and this is a picture after I put it in. This is the one that goes through the timing cover, and you can see the sealant that I put on it when I put it back in. The sealant I use, by the way, is Hylamar. This is not what Mercedes calls for. Hylamar is a non-hardening sealant. Mercedes is typically calling for a RTV type sealant, which I've used in some places, but I don't really like it. And so in this place, I felt pretty safe using Hylamar. Another thing to be aware of here, note that you got the bracket and the crank positioning sensor is right in front of the bracket. So, be careful not to do any damage to this cable. There's plenty of room to remove this bracket by removing it to the right and up without removing this crank position sensor. And if you don't have to remove the crank position sensor, you really don't want to, but just be careful of it. Okay, so mention that. Okay. I mentioned this is a good time. If you look over here, there's a tensioner shock over here. This is a good time to replace the tensioner shock as well. One, they're cheap. Two, you have to take it off anyway. And their failure mode's kind of interesting because I don't think I've really ever seen one where they weren't really being a good shock absorber. The failure mode I've seen is that the rubber insert at the top of the shock absorber goes bad. And what happens is the top of the shock absorber moves back and forth and whacks against the mounting bolt in the washer. And so you go out and start your car one day and suddenly it sounds like it has a rod knock. And it's like whack, 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 whack. And it's really startling. And all it is the top of this shock absorber moving back and forth. And all you have to do is either replace the shock absorber or even put enough washers in so it can't move back and forth. But it is startling when it does that failure. I've had a couple of cars do that now. So anyway, go ahead and change that while you're in there. Like I said, it's cheap. So now you're in a place where you can remove the center bolt and remove the tensioner. Let me go back to the procedure picture here. The workshop manual procedure tells you to remove this bracket along with the whole assembly. And on my car, I didn't see a way to do that. These bolts that held it looked like they were impossible to get to with the power steering pump on. And so I did not remove this bracket. What I did is I unscrewed the nut from the end of the threaded rod, and that allowed me to pull the threaded rod through the bottom of the bracket. Now, that also complicated reassembly because when you're reassembling this, you've got to have the entire assembly all put together with the pointer on it, with the center bolt through it, and the lever portion here over its shaft that it goes on. And then you put the nut through the bracket, and then you've got to thread the nut onto the threaded rod while you're holding the entire assembly. And in my mind, that took 3 hands. I only had 2. I ended up, I think, tying all this up so that it would stay supported while I used my 2 hands to screw the nut onto this threaded rod. And of course, remember, it's reverse threaded, so it's kind of counterintuitive when you're trying to screw it in. And while you're doing this, you've got to make sure the pointer goes on in the untensioned position as well. Okay, so the other important learning point from this, other than, make sure that you always loosen the bolt before you try doing adjustment, but the other really important point, and what I really didn't do, was adjust it to minimum tension when you put it on. And let me show you. Okay, this is what it looks like at minimum tension with the pointer all the way to this side of the ramp, and the tensioning roller and bracket all the way back. And if you look at this diagram, this blue arrow points in the tension direction, and the detention direction, of course, is the other way. Now, the design of this is so that, when you tighten it, it pushes against the bracket and pushes the tensioner in this direction. And when you have the belt on it and you detension it, the belt pulls it back in the other way. If you don't have a belt on it and you try to detension it, there's nothing to pull the arm back in the opposite direction. And I had to pry mine back because you can turn the nut as much as you want in the left direction to detension, but the way it pushes against the bracket, it doesn't pull the arm back to detension it. And so I had to, after I'd installed it, then go back and pry it backwards to get it loose enough so I could actually put the belt on. And that was really my error. I should have just made sure that I was installing it in the minimum tension position. And so that's the other really key learning point from this. Install it in the minimum position from the beginning as you put it on, and it's a whole lot easier. I had this mostly fully assembled when I was doing this. And with the 2 pulleys on in front of this, you can't get to it very well either. So it's kind of hard to do the prying I had to do to detension it. Once it's all put back together, then you set the belt tension. And again, check the center bolt is loose. And then you tighten it. Let's get the tightening picture. You tighten it till the pointer is over here and you're good. That's all you have to worry about. You don't have to use any gauge or anything like that. As long as it's a new tensioner, this will be correct. But that's also why it's really important to replace this pointer if it's missing, as mine was. And the pointer itself is about a $15 part from Mercedes. You can get it from the dealer. So I encourage you to just put this all back together with new parts. The other thing I'll point out is I've read that if you're replacing this threaded rod with an aftermarket threaded rod, some of them are not reverse threaded. And so you can't always assume that it's going to tension in the direction you think it's going to tension. That's another good reason to use original Mercedes parts or equivalent and not use some Chinese aftermarket, as Mike was saying as we were talking beforehand. So, in summary for this, it's not that difficult. You can certainly do it yourself, but replacement and adjustment are much more involved than the later designs on the later M119 engines, especially the M113 engines, which is really straightforward. So I do encourage you to do this job yourself. I hope this session will make it easier for you. And now I'm happy to go over any questions you may have or any questions on any other topic that y'all may want to ask. I need to get a chat window up so I can see. Do we have anything in chat? I do not have a chat window up, so I can't see it. Let me stop sharing too.
Hold on, we've got, what do you do if the tensioner rod is stripped?
If the tensioner rod is stripped, you replace it. I mean, that is really your only choice because you're not going to be able to tension. And of course, if you're going to replace the tensioner rod, since you have to completely disassemble the tensioner to do it, then you might as well replace the tensioner too in the shock. And let me point out something too. I'm gonna go back screen share for just a second. Yeah, I found one piece was installed incorrectly on mine when I did this. If you note the orientation, see here's the tensioner rod, the nut, and the little lever thing, and the tensioner rod sits in front of the lever thing. In my car, when I took it off, it was reversed. Now, I don't think this has any real implications for operation of it, but it wasn't correct. And so I corrected it when I put it back on. But just another thing to look at, there's an orientation issue here that you could get wrong. I don't think there's any consequences of getting wrong, although it will change the angle of the tensioner rod a little bit. Anyway, any other questions? Like I said, I don't have chat up, so I can't see it. Okay. There, I've got chat up. Any other questions about any other topics? Y'all are also quiet.
Yeah, how about, have you ever replaced a doorstop on an SL500?
Yes, I
On
have.
the driver's side?
Yes, I've done that recently. Yeah, I went through it clicking nastily for a very long time, and then it just finally gave up. You're talking about the little piece that stops the door from going way open and gives it.
Yeah, the little piece that makes two different really loud snaps when you open the door.
Yeah, well, if it's functioning properly, it doesn't make two really loud snaps. The fact that it's
No,
two
that's,
really loud snaps mean you need to replace it. Yeah, I did that not too long ago. It really wasn't very hard.
Is it just a pull out kind of thing? Pull out and put back in, or?
Yeah, I remember. I found some instructions on how to do it, but it just wasn't difficult. And in retrospect, I wished I had done it earlier because I tolerated those loud noises for a long time before it just finally broke.
Yeah, that's how this is. So the driver's door is like that. The passenger's nice and quiet.
Yeah.
It probably wasn't open very often.
Yeah.
Potentially, I guess. So.
Let me mention that some troubleshooting I've been doing recently that caused me to learn a bit about the AC systems on some of the later cars. This was a 97 S500. And the complaint, and it's not my car, it's a friend's car that I was working on. The complaint was that the AC was quitting. And this discussion would be appropriate for later 129s, later 140s, probably 202s, 208s, 210s, because they all have pretty much the same HVAC system. And what he had was the compressor would lock out and the EC light would come on. The EC means economy, which means the compressor is off, but it would stay off. He couldn't reset it. And so I looked at it, I read the trouble codes, because the neat thing about that HVAC controller is you can call up the trouble codes from the front screen of it and reset them. And so I read it, and it had one that said 241, which was refrigerant fill. And so typically when you see that, it doesn't have enough refrigerant, and that compressor cutout is a feature to not burn up the compressor for too little refrigerant. So I cleared that, and I really kind of thought it was because it didn't have enough refrigerant, and I added some refrigerant to it and gave him the car back. And about a week and a half later, he said, "I'm doing it again." And I'm thinking, oh, it must have a leak. So I ordered some stop leak. I much on a 140, you worry because it's usually it's the evaporator, and it's a tremendous job on that car to change the evaporator. So what I do is I put some sealant in the AC system first. But so I got it over to my house and looked at it, and I ensured that it had plenty of refrigerant. I actually added some more refrigerant until it was a little bit overcharged. Gave it back to him, and about an hour after I gave it back to him, it locked out the compressor again. And I was sure it had plenty of charge. And so that was kind of weird. I went and got the car, gave one of mine to use for a while. And in fact, I drove this car to our karting event at Brazelton. So you all saw that silver S500 coupe. And the odd thing was it locked out the compressor twice on me on the way. I was able to reset it, of course, but it was 54 degrees outside, and it was locking out the compressor. Now I drove home. It was 80 degrees when I drove home, and the AC was freezing me out all the way home with no problems. A little bizarre. And here's what I learned. The other thing, the neat thing about these systems is that you can also get it to tell you sensor data. And so you can read the exterior air temperature, the interior temperature, it's sensing the evaporator temperature on both sides, or the heater temperature on both sides, the evaporator temperature, the refrigerant pressure, and the refrigerant temperature. And the cars was originally reading the wrong refrigerant pressure, so I actually changed the HVAC control unit, but that didn't fix it. But I noted that it was reading refrigerant temperature at 109 degrees when it was 54 degrees outside. And the way this system works, it doesn't have a specific pressure set point where it cuts off the compressor. It has a lookup table for a pressure temperature relationship for the refrigerant. And if it's below a certain amount, then it cuts off the compressor. And what was going on with that car is it had a bad refrigerant temperature sensor that was always showing at least 109 degrees. And 4 bar for 109 degrees is too little refrigerant pressure. 4 bar for 55 degrees is perfectly fine. And it was cutting it off on for that instead of the obvious reason of not having enough refrigerant in it. Very, very weird. And Mercedes doesn't really publish, its pressure temperature curve that it cuts it out on, but I believe it's probably about the saturation temperature and pressure for the refrigerant. That's what would make sense. So my next job on that car is going to be to replace that sensor, which means you have to evacuate the whole system and recharge it again. But it's about a $40 part. Anyway, so that's my latest bit of troubleshooting. Any other questions, comments, or things y'all want to talk about? Oh, what sealant do I recommend? Brian asked. For that, I use Hylamar. And Hylamar is just neat sealant that was developed for jet engines quite a while back. It's a very, very sticky. It'll seal up to about a 10,000th gap. It tolerates high temperatures. But the thing I really, really like about it is it never dries. And so as opposed to using RTV type sealants in an engine, which very, very seldom is appropriate, this one, you're not going to get incompressible pieces of plastic into the oil system of the engine. And that's why I like it. There's a couple places that Mercedes calls out RTV type sealants. One is the area where the upper timing cover meets the lower timing cover right in front of where the head gasket is on the M104 engine. And you really have to use exactly what they call for there and use the right amount and don't get any in the engine. The M113 engine uses an RTV sealant on the breather covers, and you really probably have to use the right sealant there, but you can't overdo it there. But RTV sealants are really, really dangerous around engines, because if you get one of those big blobs down through the oil pump or in the oiling system, you can screw up your oil pump, you can block oil passages and stuff. So I'm very, very okay. After I said, oh, he says, sorry, I meant the sealant for AC leaking. The best sealant to use is called clip seal. That's what the pros used. It's not something you can buy in your auto parts store. You can find it Amazon and some other places. But clip seal is a really, really good professional quality sealant. You have to be very careful to follow the instructions in applying it. It really wants you to have the system evacuated, under a vacuum when you give it the sealant. And there's some other things in the procedure to get the air out of the line when you charge it. And they give you a charging hose because you have to throw it away afterwards. But it's a really wonderful sealant that, as long as your leak isn't huge, you can maybe get away with not having to replace your evaporator. Any other questions, comments, or general Mercedes chit chat?
Hey, put my soft top up and down a number of times today.
Oh, good. That's after changing 12 hydraulic pistons.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations. Did you have any lessons learned from that evolution?
I did. One major one, and I don't know, I'm sure somebody else has done it, but when I was disassembling the cylinders, so this is the main and the bow, right?
Uh-huh.
So the passenger side bow, when I had undone the top nut or top pin, and then moving it down to, can't remember why I was moving it, but the lower part, maybe to get to the lower pin, it actually got stuck in the main, what do you want? Main, where you hook the top of the main cylinder to that bracket, and it actually bent that bracket.
Ah, must have given you a heart attack.
It did. When I pulled it out, I mean, it took me. It was tough to, it was definitely stuck in there. So I got it pulled out, and the actual bow cylinder was scraped up a little bit. So I'm thinking, okay, I'm okay. Sent it off to Top Hydraulics, and they sent all the stuff back. And I went to hook it up, and the pin would not fit through one side of the bracket.
Because it was bent and not in alignment anymore?
Because it was, I guess, because it was bent enough that it changed the diameter of the hole just enough that the M8 pin wouldn't fit through it.
Wow. How'd you deal with that?
I spent a lot of time screwing around with it, and then eventually got a 5/16 inch pin, which is a fraction of a diameter less than an M8, and it would go, and it went through there. So then, but it was also, it was spread about 1/8 of an inch more than the driver's side. And I couldn't ever get it back into position correctly because of the bracket. One side of the, what it did is it bent one side of the bracket out and it didn't bend the other side of the bracket.
Mhm.
So the bracket was slightly deformed. So then what I had to do was finally, when I got it all put back together, because that's a really unique pin, I had to get a little bit longer pin. So then I had to put 2 small washers on the outside and then put the pin through. And then you had the nylon washer and then the top of the main and then a nylon washer. And then I had to put another metal washer inside there to line it up correctly so that it was lined up essentially in a straight line where it would normally go. And then through that bracket and then another washer on the outside. And it's actually a pin and not a snap. It's not a snap pin. It's the,
It's an E-clip, right?
no, it's not an E-clip on the pin that I finally found that I could use. It's you know, what do you call it? The it's a straight pin that you bend.
Oh, cotter pin.
Yeah, cotter pin. So I cut that down to where, and then I bent it to where it would never stick out any further than the outside of the bracket. And then I manually lifted the top up and down 2 or 3 times using a flashlight, made sure that all the clearances and everything were okay, because that pin was, you know, like I say, about 1/8 of an inch wider than the original pin. And there was still enough room in there. And I was able to get it all back together and working.
Wow, that's incredible. You need to write an article on that.
So, but yeah, that was a heart stopping moment when I first, it wasn't so, well, it was worse when I couldn't get the pin in it. Cause then I'm thinking, how am I ever going to get this thing back together?
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
finally got it there.
you'd probably have to take the top off the car to replace that bracket too.
Yeah, that's what I was looking at that. And I'm going, oh, I'd be going to, you know, a junkyard or something and trying to find a top to pull off and to put into this car or something. But it seems to operate just fine, no problem. So,
Wow,
but
that's
I did order a couple pins from Granger that are actually E-clip pins that I may change it out to. But right now I'm not going to touch it because it seems to be working perfect.
so what could you have done differently to avoid that, do you think?
I think if I understood that bow cylinder would just like flop around in there, then I could have made sure it was pointing in the right direction or whatever, so that it didn't, I didn't realize that it could get caught in that bracket.
Yeah, I didn't either. I've not heard of that before.
And I mean, that's the main thing. Other than that, it just, you know, the whole thing took a while, but I mean, that by itself took a lot of extra time or whatever, but
You didn't
you know,
drop
you know, the easiest part of the whole thing was putting the micro switch back on.
it. I'm glad. So you didn't drop any main bolts into the channels of the car, did you?
No, I used like 10 yards of dental floss. I had dental floss all over the place.
Yeah, that's good. Good.
But yeah, no, it was quite the learning experience, but
I'm impressed.
hopefully I won't have to do that for a while again. Unless I wouldn't mind helping somebody else. I don't want to do it as a major project for myself for a while.
Definitely.
But yeah,
but-
but now the door, I got to fix the door. So where'd you buy the part for the door? Do you remember?
Oh, it's probably FCP Euro or something like that.
Yeah.
I'm getting a lot of parts from SCP Euro these days, some from Auto House AZ, some from Pelican, but and some from RBM of Atlanta. I mean, when you look up, I do a lot of lookups like Mercedes part number something and see what pops up. And you get all these Mercedes dealers, and RBM of Atlanta has reasonable shipping costs. They're really quick and they have pretty good stocks. So I've been quite surprised.
Well, that's good. I mean, I've never used them. I use the Mercedes dealer out of Kansas City. That's been excellent for me. So do you know if they do it by like zip code where they sell it? It's discounted, right? Is it discounted?
Well, it doesn't necessarily look discounted, but when you do that type of search, you get all these Mercedes dealers that sell parts online, and they all look the same, and you almost can't tell it's RBM of Atlanta when you do it. But what I've noticed is that some of them have the parts at really, really reasonable prices, and then you get over to the shipping, and there's this tremendous shipping cost that makes no sense whatsoever. And so it's sometimes a little hard to figure out which one to buy from, but RBM of Atlanta seems to always have pretty reasonable prices with really reasonable shipping costs.
So maybe on heavy parts, they might be a good one to go with.
I don't know. They even had a AMG optioned grill for my R in stock when nobody in the country had it even in their stock system. It was amazing. So, I don't know.
Gary, is it RBM of Atlanta or is it RBM of Alpharetta?
It says RBM of Atlanta on the
They're in Roswell, right? Is that Roswell?
Oh,
Yeah.
it's Sandy Springs. It's
Or Sandy Springs, yeah.
Mhm.
Well, that was
because I
interesting.
know-
Because, we were at Alpharetta last weekend doing the audit, and I went into the parts department to get oil filters for the SL, and they didn't stock them. And they said they had them at Sandy Springs, but they didn't stock them there because they don't do much work on older cars, is what the guy said.
That's odd. I get a lot of those off Amazon.
Yeah, I figured I was there, it'd be easy. I'd pick up a couple, but I was kind of surprised they didn't have them. But
Yeah, I usually buy them 3 or 4 at a time too.
yeah, that's what I usually do. So, but
Anybody else want to chat?